On May 13, 1981, as thousands of pilgrims gathered beneath a clear Roman sky in St. Peter's Square for the weekly general audience, Pope John Paul II stood upright in an open white jeep, moving slowly through the crowd in a ritual that symbolized accessibility and pastoral closeness. And at approximately 5:17 p.m., amid the sound of applause and camera shutters, multiple gunshots echoed across the square, striking the pontiff in the abdomen, and hand before chaos overtook the tightly packed gathering. The gunman, a 23-year-old Turkish national named Mehmet Ali Aka, was immediately subdued by bystanders and Vatican security personnel, apprehended within seconds as the wounded pope collapsed into the arms of aides and was rushed at high speed through Rome's traffic to the Gemelli Polyclinic, where surgeons would operate for more than 5 hours to save his life. The attack unfolded at a moment of acute Cold War tension, and its implications extended far beyond the square, because John Paul II, born Karol Wojtyła in Poland, had emerged since his 1978 election as a uniquely influential figure in Eastern Europe, particularly in his homeland, where his 1979 pilgrimage galvanized millions and energized the labor movement that would become Solidarity, the first independent trade union within the Soviet bloc. The shooting itself was swift and clinical in execution. Aka fired from close range using a 9mm Browning semi-automatic pistol, discharging multiple rounds before being restrained, and investigators later established that 2 bullets had penetrated the Pope's abdomen, narrowly missing vital organs, while another struck his left hand. In the immediate aftermath, speculation spread rapidly, with some initial theories focusing on extremist groups, given Aka's previous involvement with the Turkish ultranationalist organization known as the Grey Wolves, and his prior escape from a Turkish prison following a murder conviction. Yet almost as quickly as the Pope lay in surgery, Italian authorities began confronting the geopolitical dimension of the attack, because the target was not merely a religious leader, but a Polish pope whose influence challenged communist orthodoxy across Eastern Europe. By 1981, Solidarity had grown into a mass movement of nearly 10 million members in Poland, representing a profound challenge to the authority of the Polish United Workers' Party and, by extension, to Soviet dominance in the Warsaw Pact. Moscow's leadership, under General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, viewed the destabilization of Poland as a potential fracture point in the bloc's cohesion, and internal Soviet communications, later revealed through archival research, indicated acute concern that the Vatican's moral authority was amplifying political resistance. Italian investigators, led by magistrates, including Ilario Martella, gradually began tracing Aka's movements across Europe in the months preceding the attack, uncovering a complex web of travel that included stops in Spain, Switzerland, and ultimately Bulgaria, where he had spent time in Sofia and allegedly established contacts within the Bulgarian embassy in Rome. The so-called Bulgarian connection emerged from a combination of testimony, intelligence leads, and circumstantial evidence suggesting that Bulgarian intelligence operatives, acting as intermediaries, may have facilitated the logistics of the assassination attempt, potentially under direction from Soviet intelligence services. Central to this theory was the claim that Aka had met with Bulgarian officials in Rome, including Sergei Antonov, an airline representative for Balkan Air based in Italy, who was later arrested and charged with complicity in the plot. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Aka's own statements, which evolved over time and included assertions that he had been recruited and supported by Bulgarian intelligence officers connected to the KGB. However, the credibility of these Claims was complicated by Aka's erratic behavior, inconsistent testimony, and history of ideological extremism, leading some observers to question whether he was a reliable witness or manipulating the narrative for personal or political reasons. The Italian trial that followed became a focal point of international attention, with prosecutors arguing that the attack could not have been the work of a lone extremist, but bore the hallmarks of state sponsorship, while defense attorneys challenged the sufficiency and coherence of the evidence. Throughout the investigation, geopolitical context loomed large. The Soviet Union had both motive and precedent for covert operations designed to neutralize perceived threats, and the KGB had maintained active measures campaigns across Europe for decades, including disinformation, political manipulation, and clandestine support for aligned regimes. John Paul II's explicit support for human rights and his moral backing of Polish labor activism represented a strategic challenge to communist authority that extended beyond spiritual influence into the political domain. Yet despite years of inquiry, arrests, and courtroom proceedings, definitive proof directly linking the Kremlin to the assassination attempt remained elusive, constrained by the opacity of intelligence services, the limits of available documentation, and the inherent difficulties of reconstructing covert operations conducted across multiple jurisdictions. The shooting in St. Peter's Square thus became more than an act of violence. It evolved into a Cold War mystery that intersected religion, ideology, espionage, and power politics, raising questions about whether the attack represented an isolated extremist act, a Bulgarian intelligence initiative, or a KGB-directed operation intended to silence a figure whose influence was reshaping the political landscape of Eastern Europe. The survival of John Paul II, who publicly forgave his assailant and later visited him in prison, altered the trajectory of the event, transforming it into a narrative of resilience rather than martyrdom. Yet, the investigation's unresolved threads ensured that the question of who ordered the attack would persist, embedded in the broader struggle between Moscow and a pope whose Polish identity and global authority challenged the ideological foundations of the Soviet sphere. And as the 1980s unfolded with escalating tension in Poland, the imposition of martial law in December 1981, and continued Vatican engagement in Eastern Europe, the shadow of May 13th remained, a moment when gunfire in a Roman square intersected with the fault lines of the Cold War and opened a case whose full truth, shielded by secrecy and contested testimony, may never be conclusively established. In the weeks following the shooting, the Italian investigative apparatus moved quickly to stabilize the immediate facts while grappling with the larger question of sponsorship, and the case fell under the jurisdiction of Rome's anti-terrorism magistrates at a time when Italy was still emerging from the violent turbulence of the years of Lead, a period marked by extremist bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations that had hardened Italian law enforcement to the complexities of politically motivated violence. Mehmet Ali Aka, wounded during his apprehension and treated before formal interrogation, initially offered fragmented explanations for his actions, alternately claiming ideological motives, religious symbolism, and broader conspiracies. And investigators began reconstructing his movements in the months leading up to May 13th, establishing that he had traveled extensively through Western Europe, using multiple aliases and forged documents, including visits to Zurich, Madrid, and ultimately Sofia, where he resided for several weeks in late 1980 and early 1981. Bulgarian state security, closely aligned with the KGB through formal intelligence sharing agreements within the Warsaw Pact framework, maintained active presence in Rome through diplomatic and commercial cover positions, and Italian counterintelligence services had long monitored Eastern Bloc operatives suspected of surveillance and influence activities. As investigators examined hotel registries, embassy contacts, and telephone records, attention increasingly focused on Sergei Antonov, a Bulgarian airline official stationed in Rome, whose role as a commercial representative provided plausible cover for intelligence liaison activity. The prosecution's emerging theory posited that ACA had received logistical support, safe houses, and financial assistance from Bulgarian intermediaries, who in turn acted under direction from Moscow, motivated by concern that Pope John Paul II's influence in Poland was destabilizing the communist regime at a critical juncture. By mid-1981, Solidarity had mobilized millions of Polish workers into organized opposition, and Soviet leadership was reportedly debating intervention options similar to those employed in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Internal Warsaw Pact communications later revealed that the Kremlin viewed the Polish situation as a systemic threat to bloc cohesion, and the Vatican's moral endorsement of Polish labor rights amplified that threat by providing global legitimacy to the movement. Italian magistrates therefore considered whether the attack in Rome was part of a broader strategic effort to remove a figure perceived as instrumental in undermining Soviet-aligned authority. The evidentiary trail, however, proved uneven. ACA's testimony shifted over time, at moments asserting direct KGB involvement, and at others contradicting earlier statements, creating uncertainty regarding the reliability of his accusations. Nonetheless, prosecutors argued that the pattern of his travel, the acquisition of the weapon, and the alleged contacts in Sofia suggested coordination beyond that of an isolated extremist. The arrest of Antonov in November 1982 marked a dramatic escalation in the investigation, straining diplomatic relations between Italy and Bulgaria and drawing sharp denials from Sofia and Moscow, both of which characterized the allegations as politically motivated fabrications. The trial that followed unfolded against a backdrop of intensifying Cold War rhetoric, with Western intelligence agencies quietly assessing whether corroborating evidence existed, while Eastern Bloc governments dismissed the proceedings as propaganda. During courtroom testimony, ACA described meetings with Bulgarian officials in Rome and alleged operational planning sessions. Yet, cross-examination exposed inconsistencies in dates, locations, and details, and defense attorneys argued that his shifting narrative undermined the prosecution's case. Italian investigators sought corroboration through surveillance records and witness testimony, but intelligence files from Eastern Bloc archives remained inaccessible, shielded by state secrecy. The complexity of proving state sponsorship in covert operations became increasingly evident as the standard of judicial evidence required concrete linkage rather than inference. Meanwhile, Pope John Paul II's recovery and public forgiveness of ACA introduced a parallel moral dimension to the case, redirecting global attention from retribution toward reconciliation. Yet, within intelligence and diplomatic circles, the strategic question persisted: whether the attempted assassination represented a sanctioned act within the shadow war of ideological competition. By the time the trial concluded in 1986, Antonov and the other Bulgarian defendants were acquitted due to insufficient evidence, and although ACA remained convicted for the shooting itself, the broader conspiracy remained legally unproven. The acquittals did not resolve the matter in the realm of intelligence assessment. Analysts continued to debate whether the absence of definitive proof reflected innocence or the inherent opacity of covert operations conducted through cutouts and deniable intermediaries. The episode revealed how the intersection of espionage, ideology, and law can produce cases in which political plausibility exceeds evidentiary certainty, and as the 1980s progressed, with Poland under martial law, Soviet leadership transitioning after Brezhnev's death, and the Vatican maintaining engagement in Eastern Europe, the unresolved questions surrounding the Bulgarian connection remained embedded within Cold War discourse, illustrating how a burst of gunfire in St. Peter's Square had opened an investigative pathway leading through diplomatic corridors in Sofia and ultimately toward the Kremlin, yet one whose final link would remain obscured by the very structures of secrecy that defined superpower rivalry. As the Italian proceedings advanced through the mid-1980s, the geopolitical context surrounding the case shifted in ways that both sharpened and complicated the interpretation of the so-called Bulgarian connection, because the attempted assassination of John Paul II had occurred at a moment when the Polish crisis was approaching a decisive turning point, and when Soviet leadership faced mounting pressure to contain ideological contagion within the Eastern Bloc. In August 1980, a wave of strikes at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk had culminated in the legalization of solidarity, and by early 1981, the movement had evolved into a nationwide organization representing a substantial portion of Poland's workforce, challenging the monopoly of the ruling Communist Party not through armed revolt, but through sustained civic mobilization grounded in Catholic social teaching and national identity. The Vatican's support for solidarity was not operational in the intelligent sense, but moral and symbolic. Yet within Moscow's strategic calculus, symbolism carried concrete implications. A Polish pope speaking in his native language to millions of compatriots, affirming dignity, labor rights, and spiritual independence, represented a force multiplier for dissent. Declassified Warsaw Pact communications and memoirs of Soviet officials later revealed that the Kremlin viewed the Polish situation as dangerously destabilizing, debating scenarios that included military intervention similar to the invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In this climate, Western intelligence services evaluated whether eliminating John Paul II might have been perceived in Moscow as a method of weakening the moral infrastructure supporting Polish resistance. Yet the evidentiary challenge remained acute. While motive could be articulated within Cold War logic, direct documentary proof linking the KGB to operational directives in Rome did not surface during the Italian trial. Italian magistrates attempted to reconstruct a chain of facilitation connecting Acca's time in Sofia to alleged meetings in Rome, examining travel manifests, telephone, contacts, and embassy surveillance, and prosecutors argued that Bulgarian state security, known as the DS, functioned as a trusted partner of the KGB in external operations, making it a plausible intermediary. However, defense counsel emphasized the absence of material evidence. No intercepted communications, no financial records conclusively tying Bulgarian officials to the weapon purchase, and no witness testimony independent of Acca's shifting statements. Acca's credibility became the fulcrum of the case. He alternated between detailed claims of coordination and contradictory accounts that introduced confusion into the proceedings. His erratic courtroom behavior, including grandiose statements and ideological pronouncements, further undermined the prosecution's effort to present him as a reliable narrator of a complex conspiracy. Italian judges, bound by evidentiary standards rather than geopolitical plausibility, ultimately acquitted Sergei Antonov and the other Bulgarian defendants in 1986, citing insufficient proof beyond reasonable doubt. The acquittal did not amount to a definitive exoneration in the eyes of intelligence analysts, but it marked the legal conclusion of the principal conspiracy trial. Parallel to the courtroom drama, Western intelligence agencies conducted their own assessments. Some analysts within the CIA and other services considered the possibility of indirect Soviet involvement through cutouts, noting the KGB's history of active measures and clandestine operations designed to advance strategic objectives without traceable attribution. Others cautioned against overinterpretation, pointing to the lack of corroborating intelligence intercepts or defectors' testimony explicitly confirming a Kremlin directive. The opacity of Soviet decision-making structures compounded the uncertainty. The KGB's operational files, if they existed, were inaccessible, and the internal deliberations of the Politburo remained classified within a closed system. The assassination attempt therefore became emblematic of a broader problem in Cold War historiography: how to assess responsibility in the absence of documentary transparency. The collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe at the end of the decade and the subsequent partial opening of archives provided new fragments of evidence, but no definitive smoking gun. Bulgarian investigative commissions in the 1990s revisited the case, and while some documents suggested contacts between ACA and Bulgarian officials, they did not conclusively establish a directive from Moscow to eliminate the Pope. Meanwhile, the political landscape in Poland transformed dramatically. In December 1981, just months after the shooting, General Wojciech Jaruzelski imposed martial law, suppressing solidarity and detaining thousands of activists. The Vatican responded cautiously, balancing condemnation of repression with diplomatic engagement intended to prevent Soviet military intervention. John Paul II's survival allowed him to continue exerting influence throughout the decade, culminating in renewed papal visits that sustained the moral legitimacy of the opposition. By 1989, negotiations between the Polish government and Solidarity led to semi-free elections and the formation of a non-communist government, marking a pivotal moment in the unraveling of Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe. In retrospect, the failure of the assassination attempt preserved a figure whose role in sustaining Polish civil resistance would prove consequential in the final years of the Cold War. The unresolved nature of the Bulgarian connection underscores the complexity of intelligence attribution in an era defined by covert action and deniable intermediaries. Operation files may have been destroyed, compartmentalized, or never formally recorded. Alternatively, the attack may have been the initiative of non-state actors exploiting geopolitical tensions for their own motives. The evidentiary ambiguity has ensured that the full truth remains contested, with historians and intelligence veterans divided over interpretation. What is clear is that the May 13th shooting cannot be disentangled from the broader ideological confrontation of the era. It occurred at the intersection of faith and geopolitics, where a spiritual leader had become a strategic variable in the contest between Moscow and the West. The Italian investigation illuminated possible pathways through Sofia toward the Kremlin, but legal standards demanded proof that geopolitical logic alone could not supply. The case remains suspended between plausibility and certainty, shaped by a Cold War environment in which secrecy, proxy networks, and state denial were integral components of power politics, and in that suspension lies its enduring historical resonance. As the 1980s progressed, and the Cold War entered a new phase under the leadership transitions in Moscow, from Brezhnev to Andropov, and later to Gorbachev, retrospective analysis of the 1981 assassination attempt increasingly intersected with shifting intelligence disclosures. Yet, even as archives partially opened after the collapse of communist regimes. The evidentiary landscape surrounding the Bulgarian connection remained fragmented and inconclusive. Western investigators and journalists sought corroboration in newly accessible Eastern European files, examining whether directives or operational notes existed that could substantiate AKA's allegations of Bulgarian facilitation and potential Soviet sponsorship. Bulgarian parliamentary commissions convened in the early 1990s reviewed internal security records, and while some documentation confirmed that Bulgarian intelligence maintained routine contacts with foreign nationals in Rome and elsewhere, no explicit order to target the Pope surfaced in the materials made public. Former intelligence officials offered divergent accounts, some asserting that the KGB had strategic motive to neutralize John Paul II, given his catalytic influence in Poland. Others contending that the risk of international backlash would have rendered such an operation imprudent at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The absence of definitive documentary proof fueled competing narratives. One positing a sophisticated covert operation executed through layered intermediaries to ensure deniability. The other framing the assassination attempt as the act of a radicalized individual whose later claims of conspiracy reflected opportunism or manipulation. Within Poland, the historical context reinforced the perception of motive. The Pope's 1979 visit had drawn millions into public gatherings that openly challenged the ideological monopoly of the state, and his subsequent encouragement of nonviolent resistance provided moral reinforcement to Solidarity's leadership during negotiations and repression alike. Soviet communications declassified after 1991 reveal that the Kremlin viewed the Polish crisis as a profound destabilization risk, and discussions within the Politburo considered various contingencies to prevent the erosion of bloc unity. However, the leap from strategic concern to authorization of assassination remains unproven in archival records. Intelligence historians emphasize that the Soviet system operated through compartmentalization and oral directives, meaning that even if an operation had been sanctioned, documentary traces might have been limited or deliberately destroyed. Conversely, the complexity of AKA's affiliations with Turkish extremist networks and his history of independent militancy provide an alternative explanatory framework in which geopolitical tensions were exploited rhetorically after the fact. The Italian judiciary's acquittal of the Bulgarian defendants in 1986 effectively closed the formal legal chapter of the case, yet intelligence assessments continued quietly within Western agencies. Analysts evaluated patterns of suggested that the timing of the attack, coinciding with escalating Polish unrest and heightened Soviet anxiety, aligned with strategic incentive. Others noted that the Soviet leadership was engaged in delicate diplomatic maneuvers at the time, including arms control discussions and management of détente's remnants, arguing that orchestrating a papal assassination risked catastrophic diplomatic consequences if exposed. This strategic calculus complicates simplistic attribution, illustrating how Cold War decision-making involved balancing aggressive measures against potential backlash. John Paul II's personal response further altered the trajectory of interpretation. His visit to AKA in prison in December 1983, during which he publicly forgave his assailant, shifted global attention from geopolitical conspiracy toward themes of reconciliation and moral authority. Yet the Vatican itself conducted quiet inquiries, and over time certain Vatican officials suggested that they believed a broader conspiracy had existed. These suggestions, however, did not resolve evidentiary gaps. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 generated renewed expectation that archives might yield definitive answers. But while partial disclosures illuminated Soviet anxiety regarding Poland and Western religious influence, no conclusive operational file emerged linking Moscow directly to the May 13th attack. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the historiographical debate had stabilized into cautious ambiguity. Scholars acknowledged credible motive within Cold War dynamics, plausible pathways through Bulgarian intelligence networks, and significant investigative effort by Italian authorities. Yet they also recognized the fragility of reliance on Aka's inconsistent testimony and the absence of incontrovertible documentary proof. The assassination attempt thus remains situated within a gray zone characteristic of covert conflict, where state interests, proxy actors, and disinformation campaigns intersect. It stands as a case study in the difficulty of assigning responsibility within intelligence warfare, where denial and compartmentalization are intrinsic features rather than anomalies. Ultimately, the May 13th, 1981 shooting cannot be reduced to a single explanatory line. It unfolded at a convergence of ideological struggle, religious authority, and superpower rivalry, targeting a figure whose moral leadership had become strategically consequential. The investigation traced plausible routes through Sofia toward Moscow, yet the evidentiary chain never closed definitively. The Cold War environment, defined by secrecy and layered intermediaries, ensured that some operations, if they existed, would leave limited trace. Whether the attack was orchestrated by Bulgarian intelligence acting on Soviet direction, facilitated indirectly through proxy networks, or executed independently by a radicalized extremist exploiting geopolitical tension, the full truth remains obscured by the structural opacity of the era. In that uncertainty lies the enduring significance of the case. It exemplifies how Cold War conflicts extended beyond conventional battlefields into symbolic arenas, and how acts of violence in public squares could reverberate through intelligence services, diplomatic channels, and historical memory without yielding a final, definitive answer. The unresolved character of the assassination attempt has ensured that the case occupies a distinctive place in Cold War history, not merely as an act of violence, but as a window into the mechanics of covert conflict, attribution, and political motive during a period when ideological competition penetrated religious, cultural, and diplomatic domains. By 1981, the Vatican under John Paul II had become an actor of strategic significance in Eastern Europe, not through formal alliance structures, but through moral authority and transnational influence. The Pope's repeated affirmations of human dignity and labor rights resonated deeply within Poland, where solidarity's growth posed an unprecedented challenge to communist governance. Soviet leadership regarded Poland as the keystone of Warsaw Pact stability, and the prospect of a successful independent labor movement threatened to inspire analogous movements in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond. In that context, removing the Pope could theoretically have weakened the moral reinforcement underpinning Polish resistance. Yet Cold War statecraft operated through layers of caution as well as aggression, and the risks inherent in targeting a global religious leader were profound. Exposure of direct Soviet involvement would have carried incalculable diplomatic costs, potentially consolidating Western opposition and undermining détente-era efforts to manage arms competition. The investigative trail that pointed toward Bulgaria highlighted the use of intermediary states within Soviet intelligence practice. The Bulgarian State Security Service maintained operational ties with the KGB and frequently cooperated on surveillance and counterintelligence activities in Western Europe. Italian magistrates argued that Sofia could have served as a buffer, insulating Moscow from direct exposure while providing logistical assistance. However, the evidentiary threshold required in a criminal court exceeded strategic inference. The prosecution's reliance on Mehmet Ali Aka's testimony proved precarious, as his account shifted under cross-examination and occasionally contradicted established timelines. Without intercepted communications, documentary directives, or corroborating witnesses independent of the principal assailant, the legal case faltered. The acquittal of Sergei Antonov and other Bulgarian defendants did not extinguish suspicion, but underscored the gap between intelligence probability and judicial proof. The broader Cold War environment further complicated assessment. In 1981, the Soviet Union was confronting economic stagnation and leadership uncertainty, with Brezhnev's health deteriorating and policy debates unfolding within the Politburo. The imposition of martial law in Poland in December 1981 under General Jaruzelski reflected Moscow's determination to stabilize the situation without direct military invasion. In hindsight, the survival of John Paul II ensured that the Vatican continued to play a subtle but persistent role in encouraging negotiated solutions rather than violent uprising. By the late 1980s, as Mikhail Gorbachev introduced policies of glasnost and perestroika, the geopolitical landscape shifted toward de-escalation. Yet even during this thaw, no authoritative admission emerged linking Soviet intelligence to the assassination attempt. Former officials offered memoirs and commentary, but none produced documentary evidence definitively establishing a Kremlin directive. The case thus illustrates the structural opacity inherent in intelligence operations. Covert actions are designed to obscure authorship, employing intermediaries, deniable assets, and compartmentalized planning. Even when regimes collapse and archives open, records may be incomplete, sanitized, or destroyed. Historians evaluating the Bulgarian connection must therefore balance motive, opportunity, and pattern against the absence of conclusive documentation. Some argue that the alignment of strategic motive and plausible operational channels makes Soviet involvement likely, though unproven. Others caution that Cold War tensions can lead to attribution bias, where geopolitical rivalry encourages assumptions of centralized conspiracy absent firm evidence. John Paul II's own interpretation added another layer of complexity. While publicly forgiving Aka and avoiding explicit political accusation, he privately suggested that he believed a broader hand guided the attack. His survival altered the moral narrative of the event, transforming it from a potential martyrdom into a testament of resilience that arguably strengthened his authority. The assassination attempt, intended to silence or intimidate, instead reinforced his global stature and intensified scrutiny of Eastern Bloc motives. The paradox of the event lies in this reversal. An act meant to destabilize may have amplified the very influence it sought to diminish. 4 decades later, the shooting in St. Peter's Square remains situated at the intersection of faith and espionage, where legal verdicts coexist with unresolved intelligence questions. The Italian courts close their proceedings with acquittals beyond the gunman, yet the historical inquiry persists. The Cold War's architecture of secrecy ensures that certain episodes resist definitive closure. Operation files may remain classified or lost. Decisions may have been conveyed orally rather than recorded. The assassination attempt on May 13, 1981 endures as a case in which geopolitical logic suggests one pathway while documentary certainty remains elusive. In that enduring ambiguity, The episode exemplifies the limits of historical reconstruction in the shadow world of intelligence, where acts of violence reverberate across decades without yielding a final, uncontested conclusion. The broader implications of the 1981 assassination attempt become clearer when examined through the lens of Cold War intelligence practice, where the use of intermediaries, compartmentalization, and deniability formed the core architecture of covert operations. Throughout the post-war period, both superpowers cultivated networks of allied services capable of acting as buffers between strategic intent and operational execution. Within the Warsaw Pact structure, the Soviet KGB maintained particularly close working relationships with the intelligence services of Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Poland, sharing surveillance data, training methodologies, and operational doctrine. Bulgaria's state security apparatus was often regarded as one of the most loyal and reliable partners of Moscow, and its presence in Western Europe through diplomatic and commercial channels provided potential platforms for influence and clandestine activity. Italian investigators viewed this structural relationship as a plausible conduit, linking Aka's alleged contacts in Sofia to a broader Soviet framework. Yet structural plausibility alone did not constitute proof. Intelligence systems are designed precisely to fragment responsibility, ensuring that operational links are obscured by layers of separation. In the absence of direct documentation or verifiable communication intercepts, the Italian judiciary confronted the inherent difficulty of translating intelligence suspicion into courtroom certainty. The geopolitical stakes surrounding the Pope's role in Poland amplified the perceived significance of the attack. By 1981, Solidarity's existence had shattered the image of monolithic control within the Eastern Bloc. The movement's nonviolent, labor-based mobilization challenged the ideological legitimacy of communist governance without invoking armed rebellion, making it particularly difficult for Moscow to suppress without risking international condemnation. John Paul II's moral endorsement did not equate to operational coordination, but his symbolic authority functioned as a catalyst for civic courage. Soviet archival fragments released in the 1990s revealed deep anxiety within the Politburo about the Polish crisis, including discussions of potential military intervention. The decision to support Jaruzelski's imposition of martial law rather than deploy Soviet troops reflected strategic caution. Within that calculus, the removal of the Pope might theoretically have reduced the symbolic fuel sustaining Polish dissent. However, such an act, if traced to Moscow, would have risked catastrophic diplomatic consequences, potentially unifying Western governments and strengthening the very resistance it sought to undermine. The ambiguity surrounding motive and execution has allowed multiple interpretive frameworks to persist. Some intelligence veterans argue that covert operations often leave minimal documentary trace, and that the absence of evidence is consistent with successful deniability. Others contend that Aka's ideological volatility and history of extremist violence provide sufficient explanation without invoking state orchestration. The Turkish gunman's affiliations with ultranationalist networks, his prison escape prior to the attack, and his erratic courtroom statements complicate efforts to construct a linear conspiracy narrative. The Italian acquittals underscore the judiciary's obligation to separate conjecture from demonstrable fact. Intelligence agencies, by contrast, operate on probabilistic assessment rather than legal standards, which explains the divergence between courtroom verdicts and ongoing analytical debate. As the Cold War drew to a close, and Eastern European regimes collapsed between 1989 and 1991, expectations arose that newly opened archives would resolve the question. While partial disclosures illuminated Soviet concern over the Vatican's influence and documented routine intelligence coordination among Warsaw Pact services, no conclusive directive ordering the assassination emerged. The possibility remains that relevant files were destroyed or never formally recorded. It is equally plausible that the attack resulted from autonomous extremist action later framed within geopolitical narratives. This dual plausibility sustains the case's unresolved character. John Paul II's survival shaped the political trajectory of the decade. His continued engagement with Poland, coupled with diplomatic outreach to Eastern Bloc leaders, contributed to an environment in which negotiated transition eventually became possible. The assassination attempt, rather than silencing his influence, arguably intensified global attention on his role in the Cold War struggle. The paradox underscores the limits of violence as a strategic instrument when directed at symbolic authority. In the absence of definitive proof, the Bulgarian connection remains a contested hypothesis situated within a broader context of ideological rivalry and covert maneuvering. The shooting in St. Peter's Square endures as an episode emblematic of the Cold War's shadow dimensions, where public spectacle intersected with clandestine networks and where attribution remained elusive. It reveals how acts of violence could reverberate through diplomatic corridors, intelligence assessments, and historical memory without yielding final clarity. The structural secrecy of superpower rivalry ensured that certain questions would persist beyond the lifespan of the regimes involved. Whether orchestrated through intermediaries or executed independently by a radical actor, the attempt on the Pope's life stands as a reminder that Cold War conflict extended beyond military alliances and missile deployments into the symbolic and spiritual domains, and that within those domains, the boundaries between political motive and documented fact often remained blurred. In the decades since the gunshots rang out across St. Peter's Square, the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II has remained suspended between documented fact and enduring uncertainty, a case defined as much by what cannot be conclusively proven as by what is known. The historical record establishes beyond dispute that Mehmet Ali Aka fired the shots on May 13, 1981, that he was apprehended immediately, that the Pope survived after emergency surgery, and that Italian investigators traced a network of contacts linking the gunman to Bulgaria in the months preceding the attack. It also establishes that Sergei Antonov and other Bulgarian defendants were tried and acquitted due to insufficient evidence, and that no judicial body produced a definitive ruling connecting the Kremlin to an order to eliminate the pontiff. Yet the absence of legal proof did not extinguish geopolitical suspicion. The Cold War context in which the attack occurred ensured that motive would remain central to analysis. John Paul II was not only a spiritual leader, but a Polish figure whose moral authority fortified a labor movement challenging Soviet-backed rule. For Moscow, Poland was a strategic pillar of the Warsaw Pact, and the prospect of ideological contagion threatened bloc cohesion. From this perspective, the Pope represented a destabilizing force. Whether that perception translated into an operational directive remains the unresolved question. The investigative trajectory illustrates the structural limitations inherent in attributing responsibility within intelligence conflict. Covert operations are designed to obscure authorship, relying on intermediaries, compartmentalized planning, and deniable channels. Even when regimes collapse and archives partially open, documentation may be incomplete, selectively preserved, or deliberately destroyed. The fragmentary materials released from Eastern European archives in the 1990s revealed Soviet anxiety over Poland and close collaboration between the KGB and Bulgarian state security. But they did not contain a definitive order authorizing assassination. Analysts must therefore navigate a space between plausible inference and evidentiary insufficiency. Some argue that the alignment of motive, opportunity, and intermediary contact suggests coordination beyond a lone extremist. Others emphasize Aka's ideological volatility and the absence of corroborating intelligence intercepts as reasons for caution. The Italian judiciary, bound by standards of proof rather than probability, concluded that the conspiracy case did not meet the threshold required for conviction. The Pope's survival reshaped the meaning of the event. Instead of becoming a martyr, John Paul II emerged as a figure of resilience, publicly forgiving his attacker and continuing to exert influence in Eastern Europe. His sustained engagement with Poland through the 1980s coincided with the eventual negotiated transition that led to the fall of communist rule. In retrospect, the assassination attempt appears as a dramatic episode within a larger arc of ideological confrontation that ultimately culminated in systemic transformation across the Eastern Bloc. Whether orchestrated at the highest levels or initiated independently by a radical actor, the attack failed to achieve any strategic objective that might have been intended. Instead, it intensified scrutiny of Eastern Bloc activities and reinforced the symbolic weight of the Pope's role in the Cold War narrative. The enduring ambiguity of the Bulgarian connection underscores a broader truth about Cold War history. Not all questions yield definitive closure. The architecture of secrecy, denial, and compartmentalization that defined superpower rivalry was constructed precisely to prevent transparent attribution. As a result, some episodes remain contested, suspended between documentation and conjecture. The attempted assassination of May 13, 1981, occupies that space. It stands as a reminder that Cold War conflict extended beyond conventional military deployments into the realm of symbolic power and ideological influence. It reveals how a single act of violence in a public square could trigger investigations spanning continents and decades, intersecting with intelligence networks, diplomatic tensions, and archival revelations without delivering a final, uncontested verdict. In that unresolved state lies its historical significance, a case that exposes both the reach and the limits of Cold War statecraft, where motive can be argued, pathways traced, and suspicions articulated, yet the ultimate chain of command may remain obscured by the very secrecy that characterized the era.